What if the most photographed pregnancies of the modern royal era were also the most misunderstood? That question alone has been enough to get people mocked, dismissed, or shouted down for years. And yet, it refuses to go away. It lingers. It resurfaces. It grows teeth. And now, suddenly, it's being whispered alongside a name that changes everything. Arthur Edwards. Not a YouTuber. Not a blogger. Not an anonymous account with a cartoon avatar. But the man who stood behind the camera while history unfolded. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For more than 4 decades, Arthur Edwards photographed the royal family closer, longer, and more consistently than almost anyone alive. He watched relationships begin and end. He captured grief, joy, scandal, and silence. He saw what was staged, what was rushed, and what was carefully hidden just outside the frame. And for most of that time, he said nothing beyond what the images themselves revealed. Until now. Because when someone like Arthur Edwards is even rumored to be questioning what he saw, the conversation changes. Instantly. Permanently. Ask yourself this. Why would a seasoned royal photographer, a man whose career depends on credibility and restraint, ever risk being associated with one of the most controversial suspicions in modern royal gossip? Unless the suspicion didn't come from the internet at all. Unless it started behind the lens. For years, anyone who dared to ask certain questions was shut down with the same response. Cruel, misogynistic, conspiratorial, and sometimes, yes, those labels fit. The internet is not known for its gentleness. But buried beneath the noise was something more uncomfortable. A quiet, persistent sense that something wasn't quite lining up. Not emotionally, physically. And that's where this story begins. Not with an accusation, not with a verdict, but with a pattern. Because patterns are the one thing photographers are trained never to ignore. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The public sees moments. Photographers see continuity. The public remembers headlines. Photographers remember sequences. They notice when posture shifts too quickly, when proportions change between appearances that are only days apart, when fabric behaves in ways fabric usually doesn't. Most of the time, those things have ordinary explanations. Lighting, angle, optics, perspective. The human body itself is unpredictable, especially during pregnancy. But every once in a while, something falls outside even those explanations. And when it does, it leaves a residue of doubt. This story matters now not because someone suddenly decided to be cruel, but because the culture around image, truth, and authority has shifted. People no longer accept because we said so as an answer. Institutions that once relied on silence now find that silence breeds suspicion instead of respect. And the royal family, perhaps more than any institution on earth, has always depended on image. Carefully curated, carefully timed, carefully controlled. So when an image doesn't behave the way it's supposed to, it isn't just a visual anomaly. It becomes a threat. For years, the palace strategy was simple. Ignore the speculation. Don't dignify it. Don't respond. Let it burn out. And for a while, that worked. The story faded. Until it didn't. Because the internet has a long memory. And screenshots never forget. Every time the narrative resurfaced, it came back stronger. Sharper. More detailed. And eventually, the speculation stopped being just about one person and started becoming about the system that protected the image. That's when the tone changed. This was no longer gossip. It was a question of credibility. And credibility is Arthur Edwards' currency. Think about the weight of that. This is a man who has photographed royal pregnancies before. He knows what they look like across months, not minutes. He has captured candid moments when no one was performing. No posing. No choreography. Just bodies existing in space. So when observers claim that something looked off, and those claims are echoed quietly by people who understand photography at a professional level, the conversation can no longer be dismissed as ignorance. But let's slow down here, because this is where many stories go wrong. This is not about declaring anything as fact. This is not about proving anything beyond doubt. This is about asking why so many people, across so many years, notice the same inconsistencies independently of one another. That alone is worth examining. Ask yourself, how often do random strangers come to the same conclusion without coordination? Without incentive? Without gain? It happens, but not often. What made this story particularly volatile was the accusation itself. The word moon bump carries emotional weight. It implies deception, performance, intent. And intent is where speculation becomes explosive. So most people avoided saying it out loud. But avoiding a word doesn't erase the thought behind it. The thought was simple, unsettling, and dangerous. What if the public image wasn't telling the whole story? For photographers, that question is almost instinctive. Images lie all the time. They lie by omission. They lie by framing. They lie by timing. And the best lies are the ones that don't look like lies at all. Arthur Edwards built a career on understanding that difference. Which brings us to the most important part of this story. He didn't need to accuse anyone of anything. He didn't need to make a claim. All he had to do was notice. And noticing is something he's been doing his entire life. According to those familiar with his work and comments over the years, there were moments that stayed with him. Images that didn't sit right. Not enough to spark outrage. Not enough to go public. Just enough to linger in the back of the mind. Because doubt doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes it whispers. The problem with whispers is that once you hear them, you can't unhear them. And when someone with decades of experience starts mentally revisiting old photographs with new questions, the past begins to look different. Angles that once seemed harmless now appear deliberate. Timing that once felt coincidental starts to feel strategic. Silhouettes that were dismissed as fabric quirks begin to demand explanation. This is where the audience often splits. Some people say, so what? Even if something was exaggerated, does it matter? Isn't privacy worth protecting? Others ask a far more uncomfortable question. If an image was manipulated, what else was? Because royal imagery is not just personal. It's political. It shapes public trust, succession narratives, and historical record. These images don't just live in magazines. They live in archives, museums, textbooks. So when doubt enters that space, it doesn't stay small. And that's why this story refuses to die. Not because people want a scandal, but because humans are wired to resolve cognitive dissonance. When what we're told conflicts with what we see, the tension demands release. And the more forcefully that tension is denied, the stronger it becomes. Arthur Edwards never needed to shout. His reputation alone amplifies the questions. Even the suggestion that he noticed inconsistencies forces a recalibration of the entire conversation. Suddenly, this isn't about internet rumor. It's about professional observation. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because once authority figures begin quietly questioning a narrative, the public inevitably follows. But here's the part that almost no one talks about. What if the most revealing thing in this entire saga isn't whether the suspicion is true or false? What if it's the reaction to the suspicion that tells the real story? The speed at which critics were labeled, the intensity of the shutdown, the refusal to engage even at a factual level. Those behaviors raise questions of their own. If nothing was wrong, why not simply clarify? If the story was nonsense, why not neutralize it with transparency? Instead, silence. And silence, in the modern age, is no longer neutral. Silence invites speculation. Silence creates space. And space is where stories grow. This introduction is not about convincing you of anything. It's about preparing you to look again, to listen differently, to understand why a story that should have vanished years ago is now being whispered with renewed seriousness. Because when a man who has photographed truth for a living starts to re-examine what he captured, it changes the weight of every image that follows. And as we move forward, the question won't be whether you believe the suspicion. The question will be whether you believe the image was ever meant to be questioned at all. Because once we step into the mind of the man behind the lens, we begin to understand something unsettling. Some stories don't need to be told directly. They only need to be seen. And what Arthur Edwards saw, according to those closest to the situation, may be the reason this conversation is no longer going away. But to understand why his perspective matters so much, we have to go back. Back to who he is, how he works, and why his silence has always been louder than anyone else's words. Because the moment you understand the man behind the camera, everything you thought you knew about the images starts to shift. Arthur Edwards. The name alone carries a weight that most photographers can only dream of. 40-plus years capturing the British royal family isn't just a job. It's a lifetime in the inner sanctum of one of the most photographed institutions on Earth. From Buckingham Palace corridors to garden parties, coronations to casual strolls. He has seen it all. But here's the thing. Being a royal photographer isn't just about pointing a camera. It's about knowing when not to point it, when to step back, when silence is more powerful than any flash. Think about that for a moment. The average person snaps a photo, maybe two. We might notice a detail or two, maybe a wrinkle in a sleeve or a sudden shift in expression. But Arthur Edwards? He notices patterns, years of them. How light falls in the same room at different times. How posture shifts subtly with stress. How fabric drapes differently from one public appearance to the next. To him, photography isn't just about aesthetics. It's about truth in motion, the story a body tells when no one else is watching. So when people start whispering that something about the most photographed pregnancies in recent royal history didn't add up, you have to pay attention. Not because he's accusing anyone, not because he's trying to make headlines, but because, professionally, he notices when reality deviates from expectation. That's his job. And decades of observing human behavior have trained him to pick up on the smallest inconsistencies, whether they're intentional or accidental. Edwards didn't grow up in royal circles. He came from humble beginnings, climbing his way into one of the most exclusive visual records in modern history. His ascent wasn't sudden. It was patient, methodical. He understood early on that discretion was just as important as skill. Every photograph he took, every moment he captured, had the potential to be scrutinized by millions. Every angle, every shadow, every expression mattered. And over time, he developed a sixth sense about moments that were unusual, moments that warranted a second look, even if no one else noticed them at first glance. To understand why his perspective is so compelling, you need to understand the environment he operates in. Royal life is a stage, a meticulously crafted one. Public appearances are choreographed to the millimeter. Clothing is chosen with both style and optics in mind. Lighting is often controlled. And yet, in the midst of all that control, there are fleeting instances, sometimes just a fraction of a second, where the human element seeps through. A blink, a twitch, a shift in the way someone holds themselves. These micromoments are gold for a trained observer, and for Edwards, they're clues. Clues that reveal what isn't immediately apparent to the average viewer, the casual reader of tabloids, or the online commenter. And here's where things get fascinating. Arthur Edwards is not the kind of person to speculate publicly. He is careful, measured, calculated. That is why even the faintest suggestion from him about an irregularity carries enormous weight. When a man with decades of professional credibility hints that something fell off, people lean in. They pay attention. They ask questions. Even skeptics pause. Because credibility is not something that can be faked when it's built over 40 years of daily observation. He has captured history in motion. He has photographed coronations, funerals, and royal weddings. He has chronicled triumph and heartbreak. And in doing so, he has developed an unparalleled understanding of rhythm, how a royal walks, gestures, and even breathes in public. Patterns that, to outsiders, might seem mundane or ordinary, to him reveal continuity, or lack thereof. That continuity, when disrupted, is a signal. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it exists. And when it comes to pregnancies that are under public scrutiny, those signals become particularly compelling. Because pregnancy itself is a visible, evolving process, and deviations, even minor ones, can be spotted by someone trained to notice the almost invisible. Consider this. In thousands of images spanning weeks and months, a human observer might notice one or two anomalies and dismiss them as chance. A casual onlooker might shrug and say, "Everyone looks different in photos." But Edwards doesn't shrug. He catalogs. He compares. He contextualizes. That's why even years later, he might look back at old photographs and see what he previously missed. What once seemed natural can, in hindsight, appear staged, manipulated, or inconsistent. And it is precisely this ability to reinterpret and reassess with the wisdom of experience that makes his observations so significant. Yet Edwards' power doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from observation. A royal photographer is, first and foremost, an observer. He doesn't need to accuse. He doesn't need to confront. The camera speaks for him. Every image captured is a silent witness, a record that can be revisited endlessly. And for someone like Edwards, whose career has been defined by those silent witnesses, anomalies are impossible to ignore. They demand attention. They demand questions. And when those questions are finally voiced, even indirectly, they carry immense weight. Here's where the story becomes almost cinematic. Imagine a man who has spent decades documenting every public moment of a family under immense scrutiny. Imagine him revisiting those same images years later. What does he see now that he didn't see then? The angles, the postures, the silhouettes, all familiar, yet somehow slightly altered. What was once dismissed as natural variation now seems intentional, perhaps subtle, perhaps inconsequential, but enough to spark curiosity, enough to make even the most disciplined observer pause. And pause he did, because for Arthur Edwards, pause is part of the process. Observation without reflection is meaningless. In photography, as in life, it's the subtle patterns that tell the deepest stories. And over time, he began noticing a pattern in images that had circulated for years. Images that seemed consistent, polished, and perfectly presented to the public. And yet, for someone trained to detect nuance, inconsistencies began to emerge. Tiny, almost imperceptible deviations that raised questions. Questions that he would carry silently, privately, for years. This is the crucial point. Edwards never needed to speak publicly. He never needed to make a claim. His work, his history, his credibility, they all speak volumes. And the mere suggestion that he has noticed inconsistencies, or that he might have reconsidered old images, reverberates through both media and public perception. It forces a pause. It forces scrutiny. It forces people to look closer. Because when a man like Edwards observes, people listen, even if what he says is only hinted at rather than declared outright. Now, think about the stakes. We are not just discussing casual photos here. We are talking about the most photographed, most scrutinized family in the world. Every image has been dissected, analyzed, and debated countless times. And yet, even in that saturated space, someone with Edwards' experience can still find anomalies that others have missed. That's not coincidence. That's expertise. That's a lifetime spent watching, comparing, and understanding human behavior at a level few outsiders could comprehend.